New achievement unlocked. Brand new sound for the Matt Sager podcast. This is the Matt Sager podcast 2.0. You're witnessing its debut in real time. With great thanks to my good friend Bill Cates, who got me really set up with this awesome configuration for Pro Tools. It's going to take an enormous amount of work away from me, free me up to provide more content more frequently, and do less editing. And also, and forgive me if this sounds a bit egotistical, I think it makes me sound really great. To the extent I sounded good in the first place, this has really enhanced my sound. It's going to be really a good thing for the future of the Matt Sager podcast going forward. So massive thanks to Bill, who you may also know online as SoundPup, who's both a voiceover artist, an actor, sound designer, producer, writer, the works. Can't recommend him highly enough. And especially if you're lucky enough to be his friend, then you've really struck gold. So thanks to him. And with that, that's everything nice I'm going to say tonight out of the way. Now that that's been taken care of, let's talk about Bill Maher for a moment. Bill Maher has never seen a bar set so low that he's not willing to stoop even lower. You may recall that last week I did an episode of this podcast in which I called out Mike Francesa, sports talk personality at WFAN, for his disgusting response to the death of Stan Lee.
Eddie in Hoboken, what's up, Eddie?
Hey, what's up, Mike?
What's happening?
Hey, Mike, Stan Lee died today. Did you ever meet the guy? What do you think of him?
Stan Lee?
Yeah, Stan Lee.
I don't
Never
know who
heard
he
Stan
is.
Lee?
Don't know who he is, no.
Jesus.
Who is he? Who is he? Who is Stan Lee?
He was one of the creators of Marvel Comics.
Oh, who cares? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not a comic book guy. Is that who he is, Stan Lee? The guy
He created Spider-Man. That was his big thing.
created Spider-Man? Sorry. I never was a comic book reader as a kid. I apologize. Never.
So that was a pretty self-obsessed worldview. Like, I'm not a comic book guy, and some guy died? Who cares? You might think that's a rather hateful, solipsistic, self-obsessed, and selfish and hateful worldview. And you'd be right. However, come back, Mike Francesa. All is forgiven. Because when juxtaposed with Bill Maher, you come off sounding like Mother frickin' Teresa. Bill Maher, long irrelevant, deeply unfunny, presents this in many ways every week on Real Time with Bill Maher, the existence of which continues to amaze and astound me. I don't know who owes Bill Maher what, but his ongoing presence on television is astounding to me. I've spoken before on this podcast about a radio show I used to produce for Westwood One, hosted by David Brenner, who had been out of the public eye much longer than he'd ever been in it. Sad though it was, David was a very nice man. The world had passed him by, and he was very upset when he tried to do the radio show and found it was very difficult to be spontaneous, to be funny, to keep filling airtime. And so we brought in staff members to sit near him and laugh at every dumb joke he told. And I apologize. My whole spiel here is not to speak ill of the dead, but it was not a funny show. David Brenner was not a talent who was ever suited to radio or who'd ever tried it or who'd ever had any ambition towards it. So it made sense that he wasn't a great broadcaster. But what they did to try and appease him, to keep him happy and hopefully make the show keep it afloat somehow, was fill it with Westwood One staffers who would just laugh uproariously at any little half-hearted joke he'd throw out. Like, oh, so, you crossed the street and you thought you saw a hot dog, but it was a hot cat instead. And we'd all go, it's so funny. So I know how to spot someone who is an egotist, whose ego is failing him, who needs reassurance, and who wants to telegraph to the audience, look, this is funny. Look at all the people near me laughing. And every week on that stupid show, Maher wraps up with this panel and goes, all right, new rule. Pigs are now cats. And like real intelligent, important people are sitting there, like Van Jones, Ariana Huffington, people who I know for a fact hate him personally, like Ann Coulter, and they all go, and they're just like clutching their chests and holding in the guffaws from the hilarity of it all. It's so spontaneous, unless you stop and look for half a second and look at how deeply intentional, how forced it all is. That tells me everything you need to know about Bill Maher. And so I've known that about him for quite some time. He's not been funny. He tries to compensate for that by having this panel laugh uproariously at every half-hearted joke he tells. And look, you know what it is with Bill Maher. This is the deal. I spoke of the world passing David Brenner by, and it did. But Bill Maher was doing the, hey, I'm an angry liberal thing. before my former employer, Jon Stewart, was doing it. And when Jon did it, he did it better. He became extremely popular on the world stage, which no one ever thought Jon would do. When I worked for Jon Stewart, we were on Channel 9, syndicated on WOR, and these like lame fly-by-night local channels. This was before cable was as ubiquitous and as heavily populated with homes for niche shows like this. And everyone thought that Jon was just detritus, waste. Paramount had even given us someone in-house, an executive who was called the executive in charge of production. And all she would do, 8 hours a day, every day, would go into Jon's office and go, you know we're going to cancel you soon, right? You know you've got no future, right? You know the show sucks. So people like Bill Maher, who were enjoying this real, unique stance as the outrageous, liberally minded, somewhat controversial political comedian, really had the rug pulled out from under them. When Jon came, did a similar kind of concept, but blew Bill out of the water, not only in terms of popularity, but clearly in terms of talent, in terms of his natural abilities. And, you know, look, none of these people are spring chickens, but Bill's got a good 25 years on Jon, I believe. So somebody younger came along and did it better, and then it continued. Stephen Colbert, John Oliver, and it's like, where's the love for Bill Maher? So what did he decide to do on this past weekend, Saturday, November 17th? With Stan Lee having died on Monday, November 12th. Bill decided to hop on his little Squarespace website and do a blog post politicizing the death of a beloved artist, creative, making it extremely bluntly clear he'd done no research, knew nothing about him, knew nothing about what he'd done, and didn't care. He wanted to joke about his death to make a political point. He failed spectacularly. In the process, revealed himself to be a piece of just human shit. You know, I suppose that there are occasions in which it's appropriate to speak ill of the dead or even mock them. I would say that that would be something you reserve for people who clearly left the world a worse place than they entered it. People who caused mass destruction, who contributed to the decay of our society, who were mass murderers in one form or another, be they Charles Manson or Henry Kissinger. But when someone is known for bringing literacy to the world, for teaching children to love to read, for inspiring adults to see the true art of comics, which no other country, by the way, has this sort of stigma about comics that America does. It's only because of this ridiculous McCarthy-esque Senator Estes Kefauver, or however the hell you pronounce it, who called the comics industry before the Senate, had these televised hearings, all based on a book by a pop culture psychologist named Frederick Wortham called Seduction of the Innocent. And so comics were forever tainted as kid stuff, despite being quite the contrary. Are there comics for kids? Certainly. Just as there are comics for adults, for men, for women, people who are gay, people who are straight, people who are intersex, people of every kind of religion. It is literature. It is a form of art. That Bill Maher fails to understand that reveals something very deeply disgusting about him. Because you might remember a guy named Lenny Bruce. And if you have any respect for stand-up comedy, you know that an attempt was made to delegitimize the art form. And the way they went about it was by attacking Lenny Bruce, arresting him for obscenity left and right, making his life a living hell, and legitimately draining the energy from him. The sad truth about Lenny Bruce is that after a while, these constant attacks, this living in fear, took a real toll on his art. He began to be rather unfunny. He would jump up on stage and recite court transcripts just to, there was no fun left in him anymore. And yet stand-up endures, and people like Bill Maher follow in this giant's footsteps. And so he clearly misses the point about Stan Lee and comics, and in any event is just a grotesque piece of shit for writing this. This published on Bill Maher's website, I guess it's billmaher.com. Again, it was this past Saturday, and the post is titled Adulting. Oh, new rule, adulting. How witty. You Canadian rascal, you. Let's see what Bill Maher's got to say about how funny it is that Stan Lee passed at the age of 95 after working tirelessly to build a giant multi-billion-dollar industry that brings people together, that inspires people to do all kinds of creative things with their lives, that promotes tolerance and unity, that in the 60s and the Goldwater era, Stan personally penned missives that would accompany the letter column called Stan's Soapbox, in which he would write stuff to the effect of, listen, kids, here's what a bigot is. A bigot is somebody who you don't like them because they're a certain race or a certain gender. It's all well and good to have a problem with one woman. But if you don't like women, you're a bigot. You may have a black friend who you have a falling out with. But if that means you don't like black people, you're a bigot, and bigots are horrible. If you want to take a shit on that guy, you need to be on much firmer ground than Bill Maher is here. So he begins this adulting column. The guy who created Spider-Man and the Hulk has died. He also created the X-Men, Black Panther, Fantastic Four, the Avengers, Iron Man, Doctor Strange. An actual list of the characters that Stan Lee created would take up way more space than this little dumb, glib, idiotic, quote, think piece, end quote, that Bill shat out on Saturday. So the guy who created Spider-Man and the Hulk has died, and America is in mourning. Deep, deep mourning for a man who inspired millions to, I don't know, watch a movie, I guess. Oh, that's so cute when you write as if you're talking. Oh, what a wit you are. Someone on Reddit posted, I'm so incredibly grateful I lived in a world that included Stan Lee. Personally, I'm grateful I lived in a world that included oxygen and trees, but to each his own. Well, that's a wonderful, absolutely apt comparison. Comparing the life and work of a man to nature is obviously the point to be made here. What a wonderful wit you are, Bill. Now, I have nothing against comic books, he goes on. I read them now and again when I was a kid, and I was all out of Hardy Boys. All right, we get it, Bill. You're old. You're older than dirt. You're older than all of the Rolling Stones put together, and that's part of why you're so desperately unfunny and irrelevant. But you've got to be really, really low. You've got to be thinking very poorly of yourself and of your prospects and of your place in the world. You got to have a very low opinion of your own humor when you decide, all right, I don't have anything funny to say, so let me be cruel and celebrate the fact that a man died. He goes on. But the assumption everyone had back then, both the adults and the kids, was that comics were for kids. And when you grew up, you moved on to big boy books without the pictures. What an imbecile. You know what else people said back then? That rock music was the devil's potion. That marijuana was a gateway drug to sex with Negroes. That jazz was the devil's noise. You're 100 years old, Bill. It is 2018. It's almost 2019. Climb on down from out of your own ass and join the rest of us. And don't ever politicize somebody's death. Because, let's see, there's got to be a point to this other than laughing and enjoying the fact that a man beloved by millions has died. So what is the point? Well, let's see. He says, but then 20 years or so ago, something happened. Adults decided they didn't have to give up kid stuff. Yeah, 20 years ago, racial profiling was the norm. Hip-hop music was frowned upon. Lots of stuff has changed, Bill. You know what? We don't use lead paint anymore. You might have noticed. Or you might not have. So adults decided they didn't have to give up kid stuff, and so they pretended comic books were actually sophisticated literature. Having never read one, how can you judge that someone is pretending anything is anything? Who are you to speak on a topic you haven't researched? Why would you sit down and type out a blog post celebrating a man's death, dismissing an entire art form and all of its adherents who number in the billions, way more than your fans, without doing a Google search? History of comics. Stan Lee. Just type in Stan Lee in Google. Just read his frickin' Wikipedia page, you imbecile. So they pretended comic books were actually literature, and because America has over 4,500 colleges, which means we need more professors than we have smart people. Wow, well, the research here is just stunning, Bill. Some dumb people got to be professors by writing theses with titles like Otherness and Heterodoxy in the Silver Surfer. Yeah, you know why? Because some of the finest works of fiction were created using that character. Invented by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Later, the subject of some amazing graphic novels by Stan, by the famed artist Mobius, who was among the most talented artists of any sort working in any medium today. But again, apparently Bill Maher doesn't have access to Google, and in any case, how could Google possibly know more than Bill? So, and now when adults are forced to do grown-up things like buy auto insurance, they call it adulting and act like it's some giant struggle. Real quick question. Have you ever heard someone say, I'm adulting? Have you ever heard the term adulting? Because I have not. I believe that this is a fiction. I'm an adult who reads books, who writes, who participates in and enjoys many intellectual pursuits, including reading comics. Now, Bill loves to brag about smoking pot. Think about what someone who doesn't know about marijuana has to say about Bill. He's a hippie, he's a loser, he's a stoner, he's brain dead, he's caused himself massive brain damage. He's a criminal. That is what old, unintelligent people who don't keep up with the times have to say when they're ignorant and are remarking on something. And Bill, I'm sorry to say this, but you know all those songs and poems about how one day you wake up and you become everything you ever hated and you don't know how it happened? Slowly at first, and then all at once, you're your own worst enemy. You are the guy you've been making fun of all these years. Bill, I'm here to tell you that time has come for you. And Mike Francesa all is forgiven. Now, let me just wrap up this piece of shit post that Bill did. I'm not saying we've necessarily gotten stupider. Really, because I believe at least one of us has, Bill. The average Joe, he says, is smarter in a lot of ways than he was in, say, the 1940s, when a big night out was a Three Stooges short and a Carmen Miranda musical. Oh, yeah. That was terrible. And again, please keep reminding us of how ancient you are so that it helps us to understand why you would think it's funny that a guy who worked in comics is dead, because that's how little an understanding you have of him and of the art form itself. The problem is, Bill says, we're using our smarts on stupid stuff. Oh, what a wit. Bill, you rapscallion, you. I don't think it's a huge stretch to suggest that Donald Trump could only get elected in a country that thinks comic books are important. Okay, first of all, every country other than America respects comics. Only imbeciles who lived through the Red Scare of Estes Kefauver, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So, look, only those who endured the Red Scare, brought about by Kefauver, if that is indeed how you pronounce the late senator's name, and worse still, the pop psychologist Frederick Wortham and his garbage book Seduction of the Innocent, which basically read like this. I went to a juvenile home, and I asked the children there, who were there for hitting people with rocks and stealing their money and killing people. And I got them all in a room and I said, how many of you read comic books? And 60% of them said yes. And that's how I know comic books to be evil. Now, he didn't then go to a Boy Scout troop or to an AP science class and ask them how many of them like comics, because that is not the point of this sort of math. It's to create a narrative that suits your predetermined agenda. You don't like comics. You've got a beef with comics. So find a group of awful people and ascertain that they like comics, and bingo, problem solved. And that stigma stayed with the medium for decades and decades and decades. And yet there are still the occasional fossils, bitter assholes who the world has passed them by. And relevancy, look, an Iron Man spin-off film will get more viewers than Bill Maher will ever have for all of his collected works. I get it. You're angry, Bill. You're bitter. But you are ostensibly a comedian. A man has died. And the through line from your opening sentence all the way down to the end, in which you try to somehow make the point that liking Stan Lee and being saddened by his demise, and worse still, actually enjoying comics, which is done nowhere else in the world. Bill, I know you've traveled the world. If you've been in any bookstores, you know that what you're saying is bullshit. So in lieu of getting positive press, you want to talk about childishness. If you can't get positive attention, what do? You wake up on a Saturday, go, I seem to be falling out of the public eye. In fact, it seems I dropped precipitously out of the public eye around 2002. What's a good way to get people talking about me? Oh, I know. Why don't I just shit on a beloved elderly man who passed a few days ago? Bill Maher, I have not been a fan. I've thought for years that your stuff about Muslims has been extremely racist. I continue to think that. But I did not know that you were this low of a human being, and my respect for you has vanished. Gone. And while this isn't always the best argument to make, just for what it's worth, Bill, for every Bill Maher fan, there are 10 billion Marvel fans, all of whom are heartbroken at the loss of this man who meant so much to them and who created so much of what made their world special and great. And Bill, if you should ever find that you make that kind of an impact on the world, I will mourn your passing. But in the meantime, go F yourself. Go back to Canada. Keep the weed. It's great. But, maybe get a different dose, a different strain. It's meant to make you mellow and nice and sort of not acerbic, caustic, and unfunny, and just mean and sort of despicable. And you don't want to brag about your ignorance. Again, all you needed to do was go to Wikipedia, Bill. But I get it. This is all about creating a narrative to suit your agenda. Trump is bad. Now, I agree with you on that. Therefore, liking Stan Lee is bad. Bill, I would crush you in a debate, and I welcome one with you anytime, anywhere, in any forum. About comics, about Islam, about politics, about 9/11, anything. Because you are an intellectual weakling and a pathetic bully and coward. And with that, I hope you enjoyed the sound of my brand new podcast setup. Thanks again to Bill Cates for kicking so much ass, doing so wonderfully for me. Really, really great guy. Check him out, soundpup.com. And get in touch with me, matt@mattsager.com. Or call 646-535-4788. Or hit me up on Twitter @MattSager. On Instagram, Real Matt Sager, and on Facebook, The Matt Sager. I've also got a voiceover page there, which is Matt Sager VO, and this podcast's page is Matt Sager Podcast. Also, check out the links in the description of this podcast episode. For my merch store, check out all the Matt Sager Podcast merchandise from my friends at wehavemerch.com, and of course, my Patreon. And for more of those social media links, along with back episodes of this podcast, articles, blog posts, my voiceover reels, contact info, and much more. Check out my website, mattsagervoiceover.com.